The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in different parts of the world. Thank you so much for joining us. We already have more than 200 people with us right now. It's exciting to have yet another one of our very successful series of webinars, global entrepreneurship webinars from our team from UMass Lowell. This is really exciting that we have so much participation, and I'm pretty sure within the next 10-15 minutes, the number will go up to almost 500 participants. So my pleasure to introduce my friend first, Mr. Ashwin Mehta, who is coordinating this whole program from UMass Lowell. So over to you, Ashwin.
Thank you, Krishna, and welcome to the Jack M. Wilson Center for Entrepreneurship Global Entrepreneurship Education webinars. This is our fourth webinar in this year, and we are very pleased to have one of the more critical topics that we need to teach students about is the team management, team building and management. Of all the items that an entrepreneur needs to look at it, building a team to execute the plan is probably the most important one. And our presenter will be Professor Michael Susta. Dr. Susta received his PhD in organization behavior and the strategy, and he has been teaching at the UMass Lowell for several years. And he's teaching many of the global entrepreneurship classes as well. So with that, I will have Dr. Susta discuss the team building and management.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Ashwin. Thank you. And thank you all for attending wherever you are. Good day. The picture there, that's me, but then also that beautiful picture is our building at UMass Lowell campus. That's the business school building, Pulicino Tong building. So unfortunately, we can't be there right now, as probably most of you are aware, because we're in a lockdown mode like most of you. So, but nonetheless, we are carrying on. And it's, in fact, one of the good things about a profession like the one I have is that I can do a lot of the work that I do right from my own office. So let me talk about, give you a brief agenda here, what I'm going to cover today. And so as Ashwin mentioned, I'm going to be covering team building and team formation, team management, and largely in a startup context. So I'll give you kind of a very brief overview of some findings in the academic literature on teams. It's an extensive literature, and I obviously cannot do it justice in this brief amount of time. But then I'll also then focus on how I incorporate some elements of teaching teamwork and building teams and managing teams in the classroom. So I'll go into that in some detail as well. I'll present a case, for instance, that I do in classroom setting, and we won't obviously do it here, but I will mention it as a useful tool that you could use with your own students. Okay, so entrepreneurial teams. I'll start out with a very sort of basic question, which again, if we were in a more interactive environment, I would pause and have you discuss some of these things. But given the setup that we have, I'll kind of go through these. But again, much of how we do and teach entrepreneurship. So a brief background to me is, as Ashwin mentioned, I got my PhD in org theory and strategy and entrepreneurship. I teach entrepreneurship and innovation courses here at UMass Lowell, primarily entrepreneurial finance and managing innovation course. My research is primarily related to tech transfer and entrepreneurial finance. So I often, in the classroom, though, I do have a lot of engagement with the students, and I would definitely encourage that of all of you as well. So one of the things that we are very much about is experiential learning. So you can do a lot of things even within the classroom to get students up and about and out of their seats. And so one of the things I'll start off with is basically, what is a startup team? So it sounds like a fairly obvious question, but in fact, both from an academic sense and then from a practical sense, it's really not really that easy. And a lot of what I'll be talking about today is kind of get to the nuts and bolts of what a startup team is and certain dynamics within a team. So a fairly recent summary of the academic research on startup teams has really boiled it down to startup teams really must meet three key dimensions. So first of all, you have to be part of the team, you really need some type of ownership in the entity itself, in the venture. And we're really talking now about equity ownership. And it doesn't necessarily have to be dollars. So certainly dollars matter, but you also could have contributed equity, what we call sweat equity. So basically hard work. You put in a lot of time, energy, and effort into this thing. That counts as what we call sweat equity. But you should have some vested interest in the entity itself. And money alone is not going to do it. And you'll see why in a couple points here. Because you also need to be involved in strategic decision making for the venture. So again, I'm talking about the startup team. So you could have someone contribute equity funding who's just basically an investor. So we're making a distinction here between being an investor or actually being a founder. So you actually have to be involved with key decision makings for the venture, and you need to basically have autonomy over those decisions. So if someone is constantly having to oversee your decision making, then perhaps you are really more of an employee than a founder. And again, importantly, certainly at the beginning of a startup stages, these will not necessarily be tied to titles. In fact, there may not really be any titles. And even if there are titles, they may not really describe adequately what someone does, because oftentimes, certainly in early days of startups, many people are doing lots of different things. So eventually, and I'll get to this in a bit, but eventually you may start doing some division of labor, but not initially. And then you need what's called entitativity. Kind of a strange word, I admit it, academic word, but basically what this means is the team itself sees itself as part of a team, and others see that the founders as part of a team as well. So that it's a recognizable social entity. And importantly, though, it can be within an existing business. So again, I'll be talking largely from the startup of viewpoint of a startup, but really you could also be thinking about this in terms of an existing business. So an entity within an existing business, so that's skunkworks or something like that, a new product initiative team. So certainly you can have startup teams within what we call corporate entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go over this in great detail. I'll just kind of highlight these are the kind of key areas that academic research has looked at startup teams. So some research focuses on the finance, some focuses on strategy, and then some focuses on the small group dynamics. And then you can see there's intersections across those three domains. I'll be really just focusing on the one dealing with entrepreneurial or small team dynamics just this morning, again, for brevity. So what I'll do is I'll talk about some general findings. I'll talk about very quickly a couple studies that I've been involved with, and then I'll get into kind of how I approach teaching teamwork in the classroom. So this basic question, we're talking about small group dynamics. The researchers are really interested in finding out how do small group dynamics influence startup team outcomes. And there's very kind of underlying mechanisms or causal processes that people use to investigate this question. They're basically looking at cognitive structures, or how people within a team think about things, how they process information, make decisions, and things like that. So on the one hand, you're talking about collectively, how do we engage in these cognitive processes, but then we also want to look at it, how the relationships are within a team and how those might affect certain outcomes. So what do the things that lead? So again, positive outcomes, again, it depends on the context. It could be getting funding. It could be delivering a new product. It could be coming up with a new idea, right? So a lot of different outcomes. It could be just team satisfaction, things like that. So you could have psychological outcomes, but more often than not, a lot of research is focused on fairly tangible outcomes. So on what leads to positive outcomes? Well, this may come at somewhat a surprise, but task conflict is actually good. So having some conflict over who does what and how things are done is actually good within a team. On the other hand, it's not so good to have relationship conflict. So it's better if you can keep conflict at the task level as opposed to interpersonal relationship conflict issues. A team, again, is more productive if it's cohesive. If you identify yourselves as a team, as being part of a team, so you have strong identification with the team. If there's trust within the team, so team members trust each other, this is great for risk taking. Studies show that in order for people to be more proactive in taking risks, there has to be an element of trust within the team. Collective affect, so this is the team generally feels good about itself. People within the team feel good about being part of the team. So positive emotions, again, are associated with positive team outcomes. But what about diversity? So this is an area that a lot of investigators study, the different types of diversity, and there's lots of different ways you can define diversity. And so I won't get into that, but I'll talk about some general findings related to diversity. So here I'll highlight this one recent study looking at functional diversity. So oftentimes when we talk about diversity, you have to define what the parameters that you're being diverse about. And so you could do fairly obvious ones such as gender, ethnic background, things like that. But probably one of the most common ones is to look at functional team diversity. So this is whether or not we're a bunch of scientists, if we have business people, we've got market, you might even take it to the lower level, depending on the type of science, the type of business. But generally we see that it is good to have a diverse team. So it's generally good to have a bigger team as well, up to some point. But the team should be diverse. And again, why is this good? Well, go back to what I showed on the earlier slide. There's a good chance if you've got a diverse team, you are going to create some of that task conflict. You are going to then brainstorm better ideas. Potentially, you have access to different types of information. You won't succumb to something called groupthink, which is where we tend to go along with the group. We don't challenge the group. And we basically move down the path towards an escalation of commitment towards potentially a bad idea when there's no real pushback. And so at the end result, oftentimes people are left scratching their heads. How did we get here? Why do we make this decision? It seems so obvious this was the wrong decision now. But if you think about it from the process of a team, if the team is constantly patting itself on the shoulder and telling itself everything's going well, it's hard to actually get a breaking point. So this functional diversity does lead to better venture performance. So having people from different functional backgrounds on a founding team is beneficial. But with a lot of academic research, there's always a but. So there's always what we call conditional effects or moderating effects. I mean, this is a basic main effect where functional team diversity leads to firm performance. But then we say, you know what, that's actually conditional on some other things. And so what are some of these other things? Well, we find out that actually it's less beneficial. So if you're pursuing an innovation strategy, so if you are really going for a very innovative product or solution, what this is saying is that it really might be more beneficial to have really, really specific technical expertise rather than having broad functional diversity on a startup team. If you're really going for a very innovative venture strategy. However, it is more beneficial in what we call a competitive commercialization environment. So a competitive commercialization environment is basically a low intellectual property protection realm, whereas a cooperative commercialization environment would be relatively high intellectual property protection, and also in an industry in which there are a lot of what we call complementary products. So most of the innovators are providing something that is going to be provided within the value chain of an industry. And so you need cooperation from existing incumbents. These are typically potentially the purchasers, much larger companies. So if you're in one of these type of competitive, what we call cooperative environment, then having this functional founding team may not be as beneficial in that context. But if it's a competitive environment, then, because again, you may need the specialized skills that those related to those complementary products that those incumbent firms are looking for. So, however, if it's a more competitive environment where you aren't necessarily going to be providing a key input to an incumbent company, and having that broad functional diversity on your founding team is a good thing. Again, and then the last one here is that if you have a more technically focused team, that's more beneficial. So again, in a cooperative environment. So again, that's where the incumbent firms want that specialized expertise that potentially only your team can provide. Okay, how about, so again, I'm talking about diversity. This is a study that I did a few years ago, looking at diversity in founding teams in terms of what we called their founding logics. So what we looked at here is founding teams, and I took technology firms, and basically said founding teams in this kind of a space can really vary on what their underlying founding logics are, which is why did we found this company in the first place? What were our motivations? And I made the distinction between having a more business-oriented founding orientation, such as we want to make profits, we want to grow, right? Or a more science-based founding logic, which is we want to come up with something new, something novel, right? But we don't necessarily have, we want to experiment, but we don't necessarily think about it in terms of commercial terms. And so you can classify founding teams along these various logics. And what I found is that if you have a more science-based founding logic, you're more likely to pursue some of these endorsements, external endorsements. And what I looked at was what we call in the US Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR grants. So these are grants you can apply for and win from the government to conduct research. And so if you had a science logic, it made sense that you would go ahead and pursue these grants more so than if you had a business logic. But on the other hand, if the more grants you won, if you were a science-based firm, then actually the slower you were to commercialize. So in a sense, you almost sort of got addicted to winning these grants as opposed to pursuing commercialization efforts. So that's an example of how underlying founding logics within a team can affect a company's trajectory. Another study that I'm involved with is we're looking at transactive memory systems, which are basically who knows what on a founding team. So I know who's good at certain things or who's not so good at certain things, and that's what we call a transactive memory system. And what we're looking at is what impact that has on innovation, the quality of an innovation. And then we looked at the moderating role. So again, coming back to these conditional effects, does it depend on team conflict? So here's our fundamental research question here. Does this team's TMS, or transactive memory system, influence its innovativeness when the team is expected to disband, and under what conditions? So what do I mean by disband? Well, we did this in a fairly unique setting. So it's something in the, actually it's worldwide. It's called a global game jam. It's a 48-hour hackathon, basically. And we did this got data back in 2014. People convene on a Friday evening and they finish up on Sunday afternoon or Sunday evening. And they're given a general theme, and then they have 48 hours to come up with a game, a workable game. And again, the teams will form. Some people know each other ahead of time, but by and large, they don't. And we surveyed people right after the hackathon, but then also during, actually right before and then right after the hackathon. And then we had the quality of their games rated by experts in the field. And so that was our dependent variable, was how innovative the game was that they came up with. What we find is that this transactive memory system is related to innovativeness. So the more people within a team know who knows what and who does what well and not so well, maybe not surprisingly, the more innovative a game they came up with. But again, we find that there are some conditional effects. So again, as with I mentioned on the prior slide, task conflict is good. So the more task conflicts you have, then that strengthens this relationship between transactive memory system and innovativeness. On the other hand, maybe not that surprisingly, but relationship conflict is not so good. So that would tend to weaken the relationship between TMS and innovativeness. So again, some general findings. It's good to have TMS within your team. So it's good to assemble a team. And again, what was kind of interesting about this finding is most research on TMS says it takes a while for these transactive memory systems to develop and be effective. But we showed that, you know what, actually, we found that it happened relatively quickly within this 48-hour time frame. So kind of a unique finding there. All right. I'm going to now shift gears a bit and talk to you a little bit about kind of so that's kind of a quick 20-minute tour of research on entrepreneurial teams and startup teams. And again, it's a vast array of literature, so I just scratched the surface. But if anybody has any questions about anything I talked about or other elements of this research, please contact me and be happy to share that with you as well as any of the information I'll be talking about now, which will be more geared towards teaching about entrepreneurial teams in the classroom. So when I approach this, there's a really helpful book and a series of cases that was put out. He was at Harvard, he's no longer there, Noam Wasserman. The book is called Founders Dilemmas, and he has a series of Harvard cases that go really well with it. So I definitely encourage, if you are teaching teams, certainly founding teams, then this is a great resource. And it breaks down into these various dilemmas, which are the ones that I'll talk about. And again, pretty briefly, because I don't have a whole lot of time here, but I'll talk about sort of the solo versus the team dilemma, relationship dilemmas, role dilemmas, and spend maybe the most of the time on what I think is sort of the most interesting, in the sense that this is the one that's kind of really unique in a sense to startup teams or founding teams. The other issues, relationships and roles, are certainly more very relevant at any team that you're working with. But and I guess rewards are too. But there's a unique reward situation when you're talking about founding teams. Okay, so first up is it's informative, I think, to think about whether or not you should even be part of a team. And so this is a great point of conversation where you can have the classroom say, what are the benefits of working alone or working on a team? And many students, most students probably has done teamwork for their education. And so they've got pretty strong opinions on whether they like being part of a team or not, or when being on a team has worked well or when it hasn't. So a lot of what they can apply from their school life, you can translate into the decision about being a startup founder, part of a team, or being by yourself. And so do you have the necessary human capital is kind of what you know, social capital is who you know, and financial capital is how much, obviously how much money you have. So if you are missing some of those, then you go down and you go down here and say, okay, well, do I really need these at founding? So you may not really need all these contexts, or you may not need certain types of knowledge to actually get the firms founded. So you may decide to go solo by yourself, hire later, or maybe that you don't need them at all. If you prefer to work alone, then yeah, go ahead and become a solo founder. But maybe actually a big part of being part of a founding team. So founding teams provide more than knowledge and skills. They also provide emotional support, and as I mentioned, trust. So it is very important if you enjoy being in an environment where you really feel like you want to be part of it, again, social entity, then maybe you pursue co-founders, even though you may not necessarily need the skills and capabilities that they bring. They may bring you emotional support, which could be just as important. Okay, so then relationships. So now let's say you decided, yes, I'm going to go ahead and I want to form a team with some people. So some of the questions you need to be asking yourself, or the team really needs to be asking itself, is how do we deal with, what are the things we need to deal with in terms of relationships? So one is, who's going to be on this team, right? How are we going to build this team? And so when you're forming a team, then you basically are what we call self-selecting into that team, right? Everyone has to really much, it's not like you're being randomly assigned to be part of a team. You are basically self-selecting into being part of this founding team. So the one question is, okay, should we all be together? And chances are, most times that's what's going to happen. So you're going to be a homogeneous team, very similar again, so you won't necessarily be functionally diverse, you won't be gender diverse, you won't be ethnically diverse, as opposed to, well, maybe we should actually seek out some heterogeneity in the team itself. There's this tendency, again, that sort of birds of a feather flock together. So we will assimilate based on characteristics that are similar. And so what are some of these things? Well, I mentioned, again, unless you are part of a married couple team, you'll tend to have fairly gender homogeneous teams. So teams consisting primarily of men, or perhaps consisting primarily of women. You might be functionally similar backgrounds. So a team, for instance, of mechanical engineers, a team of business students, right? A team of physical therapists, things like that. But so those are fairly obvious ones. But you should also think about things that are not so surface identifiable. So there are tangible things that you can find out about someone in terms of whether or not you want them on your founding team. So again, human capital, what do they know? What's their background? What skills do they bring? So that's very important. Social capital, as I mentioned before, who do they know? Again, very, very, very critical early stage for startup teams is who they know. You'll be spending a lot of team founders will networking. And so having access to broader networks is very important. But maybe just as important, and these are the ones that are harder to get at, are these intangible factors. So decision-making style. I mean, do you prefer to have a team where everyone you have to come to consensus? Or are you, as a team, are you happy with, for instance, a majority rules and then we move on, right? Or are we happy delegating some responsibility and decision-making to one person in particular? What's your risk tolerance? So this is really, really important for startup teams. And this is perhaps one of the ones that I think if startup teams run into problems down the road, often it has to do, I think, with their risk tolerance not necessarily being in sync with everyone on the team. And this gets to, a lot of it is, how big do you want to grow? How much do you want to grow? How quickly do you want to grow? And given your answer to that, you're going to come to quite different strategic decisions. So if you're really all about growing and perhaps maximizing value of the venture, then probably you're thinking about having to take outside funding and then be somewhat constrained by what those demands are by the outside funders, where perhaps that's not your main motivation. Maybe you really don't want to grow so much. You want to maintain ownership. So you're more interested in being what we call the king, as opposed to being motivated by being rich. So again, if you have two different people on the founding team and they're very much opposed in terms of their risk taking, there's a good chance that they're going to run into some conflict. What's the commitment level? Very, very important also. So not every founder is going to be equally committed. I'm going to come back to this in a bit and what implications this has, but it's important to make sure that you at least are aware of these different commitment levels that might be, that people on the founding team might have. What's their value system? Again, related to growth aspirations, but then also how you treat your employees, maybe what markets you might enter or not enter, things like that. So those could all be very important. It's very important to raise these issues as much as you can early on. All right, so again, if I were doing this in the classroom, we might spend some time thinking about this, but there's been some research on what teams are most stable. And it may not surprise you, but it's actually the teams with prior coworkers are the most stable. So what would be otherwise, that these teams are more likely to disband. So if you have prior coworkers, that's great in terms of, again, you probably have a fairly decent transactive memory system, so you know who does what well, and maybe who does what not so well. But you haven't been in a startup environment, so that could be a challenge. But on the other hand, it's much better than being with strangers that you know nothing about, and it's also better than being with friends, because you've not been in a working relationship with them. And so with friends, and that's the unfortunate thing, is a lot of people are going to start a firm with a bunch of friends, and there you're going to really not have probably much diversity on the team, but you haven't had to make some really, really difficult decisions, and those are likely to come up, and it might come up relatively quickly. So that's why those teams are not as stable as the prior coworker teams. So again, here's an interesting quote from a venture capitalist. In my opinion, those who found companies with friends will A, lose the company, B, lose their friends, or C, lose both. All right, so again, caution there, but in fact, that is what a lot of people end up doing. Okay, so on the concept of executive titles, you do have, as a founding team, decide who gets these. And again, what things you should factor into is how committed are these people? Is there an idea person? So oftentimes the idea person, sort of the person who, it's usually not that hard to determine who came up with the idea. That person may sort of get first crack at being the CEO. But again, what other things do they bring in terms of human, social, and or financial capital? Early on, you may not have much of a choice. A lot of times, everybody's got to, it's all hands on deck. Everybody's got to be doing a little bit of everything. But at some point, you may have a question about, should we structure this organization more around divisions of labor? So, and as you can see, I'm not going to go into all of these, but there are various strengths and weaknesses associated with overlapping roles. So, meaning someone might do a little marketing, they might do a little development work, right? They might do a little coding, depending on their skills, or you could have it very specialized. So, software programmer is just going to program, a marketing person is just going to go out and try and generate customers. Things like finance person is just going to deal with fundraising and or managing the internal financings. So at some point, you probably, as you grow, will have more questions about whether or not you should divide labor. But that early on, it will eventually come to a head. And again, if you haven't had these discussions early on, as in terms of who brings what to the table, then it's more likely to come to a head much more quickly. All right, so this is where I'll spend the last bit of time talking about equity splits, and then I'll open it up for some questions. So again, I apologize, I'm racing through this relatively quickly. But again, as with all these webinars, many of these, what we're trying to do is kind of cram a semester's worth of material into 45 minutes or so. And so it's a bit of a challenge, but I personally find this one kind of one of the most interesting areas. So again, this is, I think, what distinguishes founding teams, startup teams from some other team structures, because very much these questions about reward splits is critical. So another way of thinking about this is slicing the pie, right? So at the beginning, no matter what the founders think, all pies are worth nothing. So you have an idea, and an idea only. An idea is not really worth very much, right? It's how you are going to ultimately, as a team, execute on that idea, turning that idea into a viable and sustainable and potentially growing venture. That's where the value comes from. Just having the idea, it's not really worth anything. But you probably will need to find some people to work for. So initially, you're not going to, one thing you also are not going to have, most likely, is a lot of financial capital. So very early on, oftentimes, when you construct a founding team, people are not going to be paid a salary. So why would they be willing to do it? Well, they're still financially motivated. They would like to do it because they want some equity. If the entity is successful, and if you eventually get to a successful exit event, like if you potentially get to an initial public offering, or you sell the venture, then significant financial upside for the early founders, people who had early employees who had equity. So you will probably need to think about dividing up the equity in your company somehow. And the timing on this is key. So you don't want to slice the pie too soon. So in other words, saying before it's baked. So I'll come up with an example of this in a second. Or you don't want to wait too long, right? And why does this matter? Well, here's an interesting exercise that kind of highlights how, if you are trying to make these equity split decisions, and certainly if you're trying to do it early on, oftentimes you're going to fall victim to anchoring. And this is a little example. There's a study that did this, and it's really kind of a great way to highlight the dangers of anchoring. And I'll say more about what I mean by anchoring in a second, but I'll give you a brief overview of how this study worked. So basically, and again, if I were doing this in a class, I did do this actually with a group of students that came over from India, and I can't remember what the numbers were for that group, but it did pan out the same way that this study did. So what they do is that half of you, group one, did Mahatma Gandhi die before or after the age of 9? All right. So that's what we would ask one half of the group. And then the other half of the group, we would say, did Mahatma Gandhi die after the age of 140? And so on the face of it, both those things are kind of ridiculous questions, right? Presumably, and certainly the students from India, but probably most people would be able to answer those questions correctly. But what they do is they kind of, they frame how people are going to answer the question that we're really going to ask, which is the next one. And that's how it highlights this anchoring. So then what we do, so again, we split the sample, ask half of you, did he die before the age or after the age of 9? Did he die after the age of 140? Then we ask everyone, okay, how old was he when he died? And this is where the interesting finding comes out. It turns out in this study, they found that in group one, they said the average was 50. So again, they're anchoring on this 9. So again, the 9 is sort of on its face, it's a ridiculous question, but it basically affects how they're going to answer the question. Whereas the second group, because they anchored on this 140, they actually gave a much higher age of 67. So you might want to try that with your own students and turn in, maybe the correct answer was 87. So, but again, what this does, it highlights this anchoring. So if you are making a decision about how to do an equity split, those early points that you use as a reference point are going to be hard to move off. So that's why it's oftentimes it's bad necessarily to start out with, okay, 50-50, all right? And we'll talk about that in a second, which is a very common one. But then it's going to be very hard to move off of that because people start have anchored on that. So everything will be seen as a movement away from 50-50 and maybe much harder to do. So again, so if you what's the problem with slicing too soon? Well, let's say you and a friend decide to start a web business and your friend is the developer. So early on, she does most of the work. So she gets 75%. Well, you're the marketer, so you get just 25%. It might seem okay at first. It probably rewards them adequately for the initial efforts, but what about after the site is developed, right? So now what happens? So that would be a case where going forward, the marketer is going to be doing much of the work. So that equity split probably wouldn't make sense going forward. Similarly, you could do this too late. Let's say the site's built and you're attracting customers. So now you decide to slice the pie, but at this point, you have to recreate how the value was created. And it won't look the same to each person at this point. So again, it might be very hard to come up with a good equity split well after in essence, the pie is baked. So both too early and too late can be bad if they're static, but you don't need to create them. They don't need to be static. You can actually use dynamic equity splits. So you can base these on reaching certain milestones. You can schedule them. You can use what's called a grunt fund. So in essence, this is a way you keep track of founders' inputs, and then you basically you kind of divvy up the equity based on how much inputs they put relative to all the other founders in the team. So it's often when you have as I mentioned, the gut reaction is pretty much always to go with an equal split. And there's a pretty widespread view out there that this is not a great idea. It's not a business decision, it's a compromise. I'll talk more about this in a second, but it's not shared universally. So some people say, you know what, if you want to build the best possible product, you want the best possible and longest lasting relationship, so split 50-50, you're in this together. That's a similar approach, a similar quote given by the founder of Y Combinator Accelerator. So I believe equal or close to equal splits among founding teams should become standard. If you aren't willing to give your partner an equal share, then perhaps you're choosing the wrong partner. Yeah, maybe that's an indication you're choosing the wrong partner, but I think it's a mistake to think that everybody is going to contribute to a team exactly equally. But yet people want to do it. Why? Because it's easy and fast. Equal splits seem fair. Most people have what's called an inequity aversion. They like things to be relatively equal. They don't like things to be unequal, especially if we think that there's equal inputs. We want equal outputs. But there is some research that actually does show that having equal splits it is harder to raise funding. So investors in particular tend not to think so highly about founding teams who have done equal splits. Now there's a caveat though, because certain types of people are more likely to select into a 50-50 team, right? So I mentioned a team formation is a self-selection process. So if you are a person who prefers to be in a 50-50 split or an equal split environment, you just may be someone who is not so aggressive about wanting to seek outside funding. You may not be as motivated for a high-scale growth-oriented venture. Okay, but it may make sense. Oftentimes, again, amongst students, it wouldn't necessarily be so uncommon to have equal splits. All founders are basically inexperienced, or if all founders have relatively similar levels of experience. What should you think about? So again, let's say you don't want to just do a simple 50-50 split. Well, it's really, there's no right way to do this, but you should consider a number of different factors. So one is, whose idea was it? That may matter. It may be relatively easy to identify that person, but don't assume all ideas are equally valuable. So this really means that it was a good idea. But again, going back to Noam Wasserman, he did some research that found that everything else being equal, the idea person tends to get 10 to 15% more equity than the non-idea people. Do they put money into it? But again, it's important to ask the question, does this reflect their commitment level, or are they just putting in money because they have it? What's their opportunity cost? What are they actually giving up? So again, a student, relatively low. Skilled software engineer, high. There's a lot of other things they could be doing. Experienced CEO, very high. And maybe this is the one most important. What are they going to do in the future? So what are they bringing to the table going forward? You should be making these equity splits based on incentive going forward, not necessarily what they've done in the past. So again, what kind of experience are we going to be relying on going forward? Are we going to be tapping into their social capital? How much time are they going to be spending on the venture going forward? Ultimately, what you should do as a group of founders is basically really determine who actually should be a founder. So again, go back to the very first question, who I presented this morning or this afternoon or whatever time it is where you are, what makes a startup team? Again, may seem pretty obvious, but often it isn't. So in the classroom, I gave this example where you got 5 classmates participant. We have a student campus-wide idea competition every spring called the Idea Challenge. So I said there's 5 classmates participate in this idea challenge and win some prize money to launch the idea. Should everyone get to be a founder if they want to be? And again, great discussion. Students oftentimes have very strong opinions on this. But we want to get to is not everybody. So there's this concept of fairness, right? So everybody, and this is where you can break down. Well, oftentimes people will say that, yeah, they should be entitled to it. Well, why? And then there's certain assumptions you might be making. And for instance, they all brought the same amount of effort to the table. They've all worked on it equally, and they all are going to equally committed going forward. Well, that may not be the case. So you can do something what's called the founder test, and basically boil down to, should everybody go through each of the potential founders and really find out whether you think they actually are a founder. And then you say, okay, now that you're a founder, we know who the founding team is. We need to figure out how we're going to split up the equity. So what this approach does is something called, and there's various versions of this. I have in class, I have the students do it, and I'll show you in a second the case I give them. Basically, reward founders with exceptional expertise in a certain area. So what kind of things are you rewarding? Well, do they have leadership experience? Have they been through previous exits, meaning they've taken a company to a sale or an IPO? They've got certain domain expertise. If you're in a particular industry, they've got technical expertise. They've got financial expertise. So again, these are sort of above and beyond than the levels on the rest of the teammates. Have they developed expertise in developing customers? They have sales expertise, marketing expertise, and fundraising expertise. Put it all together, and then you basically decide who's the founder. Then you start off with equal splits. So okay, there's 3 of us. We'll start with a third each, and then we go through this process. Excuse me. I think we have to say, okay, how much now are we going to reallocate to exceptional founders? We may say, okay, we're going to reallocate 20%, right? So that leaves the remaining 80% would be split equally, and then that remaining 20% we're going to allocate among the founders based on levels of expertise that they have above and beyond the other founders. So the technique I use, and you can find this online, you add what are called these gold stars for each founder, find out how much they bring to the table above and beyond other founders on the team, and tally up all the founders, and then take every founder's proportion of that total and allocate the equity that way. And it turns out when you do this, actually, a few times, the times I've done it in class, and this happens probably in the real world as well, is you very well may end up with something very close to an even split. And so if you're off by maybe a couple percentage points from being perfectly equal, then you might just say, okay, well, we might as well just have an equal split. But again, there are potentially downsides to that from a fundraising standpoint. Okay, so I mentioned I do this in the classroom. What I do is I created something what I call the founding team game. And I assign each person a role. And so there's various ways to do this. I can either actually give this to each people individually, and I've done it both ways. And then they have to go out and find their other teammates and form a founding team and then negotiate equity. Or I present all 3 of them to different teams, and I say, okay, now you guys come up with an equity split among these 3 different individuals. So the example I use are these 3 different people. So one's an experienced serial entrepreneur, undergraduate degree in software engineering, but it's been a while since you've been in the enterprise. Second person, software engineer, 5 years experience working in large organizations, currently employed, making very good salary, so highlighting the opportunity costs. And then the last person here, graduated university business, a bachelor's degree in business. This is the idea person. You've identified, but they don't have the skill set. You've developed an idea for an enterprise software solution, but you have limited software expertise. This is very common. among business students, for instance, at graduate programs. So you need to basically go out and then the idea would be that these people would then, it would be a case study where the individuals would go and try and mill about in the room, find other people that they can use to round out their team, and then sit down and do an equity negotiation. So that's all I've got. I realize I went through everything relatively quickly and on a very high and shallow level. But if there's any specific questions now, I'd be happy to take them.
Michael, can you put the last slide and then we'll go to the question, please?
Oh, sure. You want to
All
talk
right,
about that one?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for the great presentation discussion about this very important topic. Before we go on to the questions, I just want to make an announcement that our next webinar will be on May 27th, and it will deal with another very important topic for entrepreneurs. So how do they get the first customer and the subsequent customers, and how do they retain these customers, and how can they grow? So CRM, or the customer relationship management, is an important tool for an entrepreneur. So we'll be discussing that topic on May 27th. So do plan to attend that. So let's go to some of the questions. We have 10, 15 more minutes. Let's see. We have a question from Anne Cronard. Anne, you are in the audience, I think. So her question is that it makes sense that the co-workers are better teammates than friends for the success of the team. Would you take it as far as saying that one should try to avoid making friends with co-workers in order to avoid finding yourself in a situation where your teammates are friends? Michael?
Well, I don't know if I understand the question. I mean, inevitably, if you are forming with coworkers, there's probably an element of there also being, you have a friendly relationship with them as well. You know, presumably, you wouldn't decide to go form a team, a startup company with people that you dislike. Although I guess it's possible, but unless they really have a skill that you need. So. I'm not sure I understood the question correctly.
Mostly, I think what she's trying to say is mostly don't get too close to the co-workers and friends.
Oh, yeah, right. So there is an element of that, right? So I guess, which is an interesting thing. I don't think the study that I'm referencing looks at it this way, but there's certainly overlap between how friendly you are with coworkers. And so at one point, maybe your coworkers, or if you think of them more as, this is maybe a social cognitive way of thinking about things, but if you think of them more as friends than coworkers, then maybe that would be a mistake. But that's an interesting wrinkle, the way to throw around it. Maybe there you go. There's a future study for you, Ian. Run with it.
Okay, so another one is how to build entrepreneur ecosystem in an educational institutions to encourage students, entrepreneurs. We will be talking about it in one of our future webinars. As a matter of fact, there's one in June timeframe, and we also had some discussion of that last year. But Michael, you want to comment on the?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did mention the example I gave was that difference maker competition. So that is difference maker at UMass Lowell is part of this campus-wide entrepreneurship initiative. And one of the main motivations is to bring in multidisciplinary teams, potentially multicultural teams in an entrepreneurial environment. So the idea is that you can, when you have these competitions, it's really, really highly encouraged to assemble teams that consist of people from multiple disciplines. And so oftentimes, again, it's not surprising, business students will form a team together, but their ideas for an app, and they have no skills in that area. Or then you have software engineers form a team together, and they've got an idea for an app, but they have no idea about how doing things like customer acquisition, customer discovery. So the Difference Maker program does a great job of trying to assemble, encourage people to form multidisciplinary teams. And how do we do that? Well, we do it through a series of different informal events earlier in the semester to try and get people to know each other, get them in one location, have them participate in activities so they get to know each other on a maybe a little bit deeper level. And then ultimately, when it gets to the actual competition, if a certain team is strong, but they're really lacking in, for instance, a particular skill, we will make effort to add new people to the team.
Good. Another question, Tom O'Donnell has a question. Any suggestion on conflict resolution, addressing founder team's issues, third-party interventions?
So those are great ideas. So at some early on, it's probably, you potentially have, if again you may be thinking about forming a team, you have what may be called, you have something called like an advisory board, and you've got people who are not actually part of the founding team, but they're integral to the success of the company. So they would be a good resource for potentially resolving internal team disputes. Certainly, if you're part of something, Tom is again part of our UMass Law ecosystem. He runs the Innovation Hub and incubator space on campus. So if you happen to be, for instance, in a space like the incubator, then you've got a potentially resource there to go to for mediation for conflict. Ultimately, though, if it gets to, so that's early on, you probably should have some safeguards like that. Once you get to raising outside funding, then oftentimes the conflict issues are dealt for you by the investor, and it's not uncommon. In fact, there have been some studies that show that founders actually make pretty poor managers. So ultimately, if you are going to raise or grow a very successful venture, you as the founder are probably not going to be leading it. Certainly not if you're taking outside funding. It's likely you'll be replaced by a professional CEO. So that's something to be expected. But oftentimes the funding people will oftentimes make those decisions for you, unfortunately.
Great, thank you, Mike. Another question, Durga Mohan has this question. If there's an entrepreneurial team with people who don't know each other previously, then does it become an owner and employee relationship? Please clarify.
Yeah, so it could, right? So it doesn't have to. Again, the idea is that gets to this, my very first slide, talking about autonomy decision making. So if you find in the relationship that one person is primarily working at the behest or suggestion of another person, then it sounds like more like an owner-employee relationship. But I think early on, most people aren't going to be, people who are joining a founding team aren't going to think of themselves as employees, right? So that's why you need to have these important discussions. So it's really how committed to you to this venture are you? What in terms of time? What do you plan? How much time do you plan on working this? What do you plan on doing? But again, it may not be equal. It's fine that, for instance, you and one other person decided between the two you to split it 60-40. That's fine. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be working on it equally. You don't have the same responsibilities, but it's clear that there is something that the 40% person is doing that the 60% person isn't doing, and they're not doing it necessarily just at the request of the second founder. Now, on the other hand, eventually, like I mentioned, you probably will get to the point where you'll have to do some division of labor. So one person likely will be the CEO. One person might be this chief information officer or chief science officer, depending on the nature of the company. So once you get to that stage, then you are now employees also. So you're still owners in the company, but at some point you are also going to be employees, and then that will be dictated in terms of your role. So that gets to that role question. So eventually, there will be decisions about that, but early on probably is not as critical.
I think the related question from Matej Zorek is, what are some of the more effective principles or ways to delegating roles in a startup? So I think you have addressed some of that. If you want to add some more to that.
Sure. Some of it's going to be based on a function of who's on your team, right? So what skills they bring and who they know. So that's probably the easiest way. So it's less clear cut if you all have the same skills, right? So everybody is a programmer, then, and maybe early on, depending on the nature of the venture, then programming is the most important thing. But at some point, that falls away to generating revenue and acquiring customers. So at some point you need to actually, and I would say actually early on, you need to be involving potential customers in terms of doing what we call developing minimum viable products and customer acquisition, customer discovery, finding out. It's much better to find out what the potential customer wants early on rather than later. But again, ultimately, those early decisions, there's going to be a lot of overlap, and I think again, that's part of what you need to deal with your co-founder. So if you are part of a team, some people might be really okay with having a lot of overlap. So I'll do some marketing, some coding, right? So okay, I'll do the slides this time, you do the slides next time. Whereas some other people might say, you know what, I want it really clearly delegated, who's going to do what. Well, if one person is okay with ambiguity and the other person is a lot less okay with ambiguity, those two are probably going to struggle together. So it's probably just as important to have agreement on tolerance for ambiguity as it is having any specific decision whether or not we want to go with a clearly defined roles or somewhat overlapping roles.
Okay, thank you. Madhu Atre has a question. Madhu, you want to ask your question, please? I'm sorry, let me unmute you. I can't seem to. So his question is it important to have a founders agreement highlighting key roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, but again, that will probably be, it has to be dynamic. So it potentially could be dynamic. So certainly in terms of if you want to think about, and I didn't get into vesting at all, but you definitely want to incorporate some question about how quickly people vest or when they vest. And so in essence, you don't necessarily want to give everybody equity all up front. So let's say let's make a case simple. There's two of you, there's 50-50 split. Again, necessarily that. So you want to probably put in a vesting schedule so that even among the two of you, you're not going to acquire all your equity initially, but you'll vest. And typical one would be over something like 4 years, and typically would not you wouldn't get anything unless you've been there for 1 year. It's a 1-year cliff. So that's a way to incorporate these vesting schedules, a way to build in commitment mechanisms. So that would also be something important to set up early on to get people. And again, you can tie the vesting to certain milestones or things like that. So if there are certain things you want a person to accomplish, you can embed that into the vesting schedule. So it's very important to get those things up, deal with those up front as well.
Thank you so much, Michael. We have Dr. Jack Wilson in the audience. And Jack, would you like to make any comments before we end this webinar?
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Okay. Yes, no, very good seminar. Thank you very much. It was, it was really excellent, and I'm sure that there were a number of us out there that have had the entrepreneurial experience and kind of resonated with various issues. One of the things that I did want to ask Mike about is that on the issue of founders being good leaders issue. I've seen a lot of kind of contrary points of view on that issue. Certainly the venture capital and funding community, as you suggested, very strongly feels that founders are poor leaders and tend to move them out of the way. The entrepreneurial community has a very, very different viewpoint of that. And certainly we can all think of 100 examples of great companies where the founders remained in control, and we can even think of some where founders were forced out and had to come back to save the company. I'm wondering, is there good research on that, Mike, that kind of can settle that fight between the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I'm aware of one study that I saw fairly recently that looked at and I don't know what the measure was, but they looked at how founder managers did, and they scored them against non-founder managers. And again, I don't remember what the metric was that they used, but the founder managers did not score as well. But I think you raised a great point. That a lot of that is coming from the perspective of the venture capital world, and as we all know, that's actually a very small world in terms of total number of ventures that are out there. But it is an interesting question. I definitely think that there's been some research on it, but I have to take a look to see above and beyond sort of the one sort of cursory study that I'm aware of.
That might be a great idea for future research. There's a number of things like that that people have wrestled with, where the venture capitalists, which they are giving the money so they can kind of make the rules, but you know, that have a certain attitude, and you kind of wonder whether their attitude, for instance, they always say that an A team with a B product is better than a B team with an A product. Well, I think most of them would like to fund an A team with an A product, but I'm not aware of really good substantiation for many of the venture capital points of view.
Yeah, and there's actually there's been some research I'm aware of that kind of, even though that you're right that most people would say, the venture capitalists would all say that, there's actually, if you look what they actually do, there's pretty good evidence that they actually, you know what, they actually really do go after really good ideas. I mean, they really do try and go after good ideas. So in certain sectors, so they may not be as beholden to the jockey as they say they are.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael and Jack. Thanks for that question and suggestion. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Sorry we could not get to all the questions. There were quite a few more questions, but the time has ended there. Send us an email with your questions. We will be sending a link to the recording of this webinar shortly. So again, thank you so much, and stay safe and stay well. Goodbye, and hope to see you next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.